nation at war. Once again, you are going to hear the living documentary story of the 130 millions of Americans who are making history. You are going to hear them at work amid authentic backgrounds in a series of direct on-the-spot broadcasts that will take us to Portland, Oregon, Long Island, New York, San Francisco, South Chicago, and Washington, D.C. This Nation at War is a regular feature of the Blue Network, presented in cooperation with the National Association of Manufacturers.
This is Jim Backus talking from New York City. Tonight, as our Russian ally battles the full strength of the Nazi war machine and speculation increases over a second Allied front, the eyes of the whole world fall upon America. Can we continue to transport men and material to the places needed, in the quantities needed, when it is needed? Do that means a bridge of ships. And so tonight, the fate of mankind for generations to come may well depend on the performance of one section of American industry, the shipbuilders. For the next 30 minutes, you are going to hear the story of this most critical of all jobs in this nation at war. You're going to hear it straight from the mouths of naval officers, plant managers, steel workers, welders, shipwrights, and sailors, the men who are doing the job. First to Washington, where Rear Admiral Emory S. Land, chairman of the Maritime Commission, will tell us something of the size of the job.
As chairman of the Maritime Commission, Admiral Land, we look to you for some straight, cold facts in the gigantic task our country faces in merchant shipbuilding.
The first straight, cold fact, Mr. Rice, is that we must build better than 800 ships this year and 1,500 next year.
This is the biggest job American industry ever tackled. How in the world is it being done, Admiral?
Several months ago, I testified before congressional committees to the effect that if productivity of labor could be increased 12.5% in 42, 25% in 43, the Maritime Commission would readily meet the President's merchant marine shipbuilding program in 42 and 43. There was, of course, our standard proviso, namely that the necessary steel be furnished to the Maritime Commission. It gives me the greatest pleasure to say that not only has the productivity of labor increased to the percentages indicated, but as far as surpassed them. In the phraseology of the shipbuilding boys, we are going to town.
Going to town all up and down the Atlantic coast, the Pacific coast, and the Gulf, right?
More than that, Mr. Rice. The job is being done in practically every state in the Union. The actual shipyards are only a part of the building of a ship. American industrial management has done a remarkable job converting peacetime manufacturing into parts for our merchant fleet. Into the shipyards from all over the country roll trainloads of parts. And in the yards themselves, the time required to build a ship grows less and less.
You emphasize speed, Admiral Land.
We have to. Now, this year, next year, is when we need ships. Ships to carry troops, military equipment, heavy cargoes of tanks and artillery, millions of rounds of ammunition, heavy construction steel for railways and bridges. We must carry food, unnumbered tons of it, to our troops, to our allies. You see, Mr. Rice, why we of the Maritime Commission think and act and talk speed.
Indeed I do, Admiral Land, which makes me wonder just how long it takes to build a ship these days.
The answer to that question is proof that American ingenuity, American workers, and American management can do anything we ask when challenged the way this country is challenged today. In World War I, 10,000-ton ship required from 10 to 12 months to build. Last spring, with mass production methods, we were building 10,000-ton Liberty ships on an average of 156 days.
Why, that's less than one-half the time taken in World War I.
At the present rate of progress, we expect to reach the average of 105 days by September.
Only 105 days from the laying of the keel to the launching?
No, from the laying of the keel to delivery, which is quite a different thing.
Could you tell us the speed record, Admiral Land, in the building of a Liberty ship?
46 days.
You mean 46 days, a month and a half after the keel was laid, a ship was all fitted and ready to go places?
With 9,146 tons of cargo, yes, sir.
Could you tell us where that record ship was built?
It was built by the Oregon Shipbuilding Corporation, one of Mr. Henry Kaiser's yards. The owner of this yard and some of the other shipbuilders are now out to beat this record. They are predicting that they're going to build Liberty ships in 30 days.
Honest now, Admiral, you don't really believe that, do you?
Indeed I do. Why not? We are reaching the point where the members of the Maritime Commission will refuse to be surprised when some yard does build a Liberty ship for us in 30 days.
Well, here's hoping. Oh, by the way, Admiral, can you tell us how many ships were completed in July?
71 ships of 790,300 deadweight tons. 52 of these were Liberty ships, I am happy to say.
Thank you, Admiral Land. This nation at war. And now, out on the West Coast, thousands and thousands of men and women are at work on these ships that Admiral Land told us about. The ingenuity of American management, coupled with the skill of American workers, is breaking all-time world records for speed in ship construction. Our next jump is to the shipbuilding yard Admiral Land mentioned, the Portland works of the Oregon Shipbuilding Corporation. Phil Irwin of station KEX is standing by in the yard of the Oregon Shipbuilding Corporation at Portland. By the time you count 10 seconds, you will hear his voice.
Under the far-seeing leadership of Henry J. Kaiser, over 35,000 employees of the Oregon Shipbuilding Corporation have combined skill, sweat, and high morale to establish a record for delivery of more Liberty ships than any other shipyard. When the keel for the very first ship was laid on May 19, 1941, Mr. Kaiser had never built a ship before, and over 90% of the employees had never worked in a shipyard before. That first Liberty ship, the Star of Oregon, was delivered to the government December 31st, 1941, 226 days after the keel was laid. In sharp contrast was the Thomas Bailey Aldrich, which, on June 1st, 1942, required only 46 days from keel laying to delivery to set a new all-time high in wartime ship construction. But there was a definite need for trained workers before a world's record could be established. And the Oregon Shipbuilding Corporation answered this need with intensified vocational training and conducted in the yard itself. Classes covering every phase of ship construction were held for all employees desiring training to provide the fundamentals which are further developed by actual experience. Just what kind of people work in a shipyard? All kinds. Men and women from every walk of life. And they are all here to do the job at hand, the job which counts right now. As we move about the yard, we see these contrasting personalities all around us. For example, here's the pipe fitting shop, and a husky-looking gentleman hard at work. Your name, sir?
Louis Zannon. I'm lead man pipe fitter for the yard.
And what did you do before you came here, Mr. Zannon?
Well, among other things, I was a member of Barnum and Bailey Circus. I doubled as strongman and fire eater.
Did you say fire eater?
That's right. I entertained the circus fans by eating electric light globes, razor blades, and assorted hardware. But when war priorities came along, I had to change my diet.
And your job, I see. Well, how do you like it here?
It's a great privilege. This kind of work is right up my alley. And I feel really important in doing something for my country and those swell lads across the water.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Zannon. Now, moving along to the plate shop, we find another big fellow swinging a 32-pound sledge. If he'll lay it down for just a moment, perhaps he'll tell us his name.
Gladly. I'm Jonathan D. Heaton, better known around here as Brother Jonathan.
Brother Jonathan?
Yes. I'm a member of the Mormon Church, and I spent 4 years in the mission field in Australia and New Zealand.
And after that?
Well, from religion to wrestling is quite a jump, but that's where I landed.
Well, I've seen you wrestle in Portland, and I understand you help sell war bonds by taking part in wrestling matches between local shipyards here.
That's right. It's a lot of fun, and I'm glad to be doing my part in every way I can.
Keep up the good work, Brother Jonathan. Now over here is pipe fitter number 13,505. But to the world, he's better known as Alexander Umansky, internationally famous ballet master. You were born in Russia, Mr. Umansky.
Yes, 47 years ago. I came to America at the age of 13. And I've been in Bally work for 35 years, except for the time I served in World War #1.
Well, aren't you rather out of your element working here?
Some people might think so, but I love it here. And then I still teach ballet in my spare time. And I have a 15-year-old daughter, Valentina, who's a coming ballet star.
And I can see you swell with pride when you say that, and justly so. Tell me, wasn't it pretty much of a sacrifice to give up the work you love and become a pipe fitter?
America has been very good to me. I owe it more than I can repay. I'm quite happy here doing all I can to help. I feel inspired and useful because, in the end, all this will mean liberty and freedom for the people. Freedom, too, for not just one art form, but for all the cultural and artistic forms which make for a better world in which to live.
I can add no more to that, Mr. Romansky. And now, what of women workers? For information on that score, let's turn to one of the first women welders, Mrs. Mary Carroll. How long have you been working at the Oregon shipyards, Mrs. Carroll?
Since April. I was formerly employed as a stenographer. However, the first of last year, I began to notice the urgent need for war workers, and I wanted to do my part.
And why did you select welding, Mrs. Carroll?
Because welders seemed to be first in demand. I took a 200-hour course and went to work at once.
A very patriotic gesture, Mrs. Carroll, helping out in the war effort like that.
The women have a very important job to do in this war, perhaps as important as the men. However, I hasten to add that the women with families to care for are doing just as big a job by standing by and keeping the American homes.
And have you a family, Mrs. Carroll?
Yes, 4 children, 1 girl and 3 boys.
What are their ages?
The girl is 18, the boys are 14 and 12.
Well, now that's only 2 sons. What of the other one?
The oldest son, Richard, was in the Philippines at the outbreak of the war and was one of the men who saw service with MacArthur on Bataan.
And if I might ask, when was the last time you heard from him, Mrs. Carroll?
His last letter reached me in March. That is just one of the reasons I prefer to do my part here in the shipyard. By working and learning, by helping in every way I can to build these ships, by contributing my own work to this all-out effort, I feel that I am doing, at least to some degree, what the boys over there are doing so wholeheartedly. And it is a satisfaction, a truly proud feeling deep down inside, to know that I'm helping to speed the day when they'll all come back home.
Thank you, Mrs. Carroll. From Portland, Oregon, you've heard the men and women who are breaking world records to send our merchant fleet to sea in time for victory. But you must remember the job doesn't begin here. The construction of these ships really begins in factories and mills hundreds and thousands of miles from the coast. The big engines that drive these ships come from many different factories, and unless the supply of these power plants keeps the pace with the speed of the shipbuilders, we'd have ships that couldn't move. Well, we're getting these engines, and we're getting them on time. So let's find out how they're doing that part of the job. Bill Baldwin of the Blue Network station in San Francisco is standing by at the Joshua Hendy Iron Works in Sunnyvale, California, waiting to tell us that part of our story. Come in, Bill Baldwin.
Hello, America. This is Bill Baldwin of station KGO in San Francisco reporting the story of a miracle of American war production. Our Blue Network microphones are set up at the end of the long final assembly line of the Joshua Hendy Iron Works near Sunnyvale, California, where monster 274,000-pound steam engines, 2 stories in height, are being assembled and tested before being placed in the engine room of Liberty ships of America's great new merchant marine. To give you some idea of what is going on here at the Hendy Works, let me tell you that this plant has been in operation since 1856, but that in 1942, 3 times the manufactured material will be turned out here as in all of the other 86 years combined. A little over a year ago, this plant was an antiquated, obsolete factory, employing about 60 men in receivership, and with little more than goodwill and a pear orchard owned by the company to recommend it. Today, the pear orchard is gone. Its crop sold for $1,100, and the first profit entry on the books of this new company, incidentally. But the goodwill has increased many, many times. Today, Hendy covers a 60-acre tract, employs over 3,000 men, and is turning out marine engines at a rate which has already earned the coveted Maritime Commission M for outstanding production. In another 60 days, there will be 4,200 men and women on the payroll, and by the end of next year, 8 million tons of Allied shipping will be propelled by Hendy-made engines, just like the one towering over our heads at this moment. The factors which have made this production possible may be boiled down to 2. American mass production methods, plus American will to tackle the impossible and lick it. And now, let's find out something firsthand about this plant and the men who are turning out these engines. Here's a gentleman working at the machine right here. What is your name, sir, and your job here at Henday?
Bert Veal, and I'm a machine specialist.
And how long have you been doing this work?
I was a tool man in shipyards during the last war, but I've been a professional musician since then, until I came to Henday in June 1941, when the call went out for skilled machinists.
Well, you mean that you played in orchestras, Mr. Veal?
Yes, I played trumpet in many well-known bands.
Well, I don't suppose you find much use for your music around here.
Oh, yes, indeed, I do. You see, we have a 42-piece band here at the plant, which plays for the men during lunch hours and at special gatherings. I lead the band.
Oh, I see. Well, that's a long jump from band work to shipbuilding.
Oh, not so much. The hum of machinery here at Henday turning out these great engines is real music.
It certainly is, and thank you, Bert Veal. And now over here is another gentleman who looks as if he might be able to tell us something. Your name, sir?
Peter McCain.
And how old are you, Mr. McCain?
75 years young and still going strong.
Ah, fine. How long have you been a machinist, Mr. McCain?
56 years. 19 of them here at Henday.
Well, you must have worked on a lot of ships in that time.
I sure have, and one of them was mighty famous, too. The old battleship Oregon, a great ship.
You're right about that, Mr. McCain. What is your job here now?
Lathe machinist, making crankshafts for the engines.
Well, I understand that you're not only the oldest man on the job here, but also one of the most respected because of your skill, Mr. McCain. You are training younger men, too, aren't you?
That's right. And I am proud to say that right now, I have 3 young fellas who have become full-fledged machinists working right alongside me.
Well, how long does it take on the average to train these new men?
It all depends on the lad's willingness and the machine he's working on. But I'd say about a year on the average. When I was a boy, it took about 5 years because most of the work was done by hand.
And thank you, Peter McCain, 75 years young. Keep up the good work. And now here's another gentleman. What is your name, sir?
Charles E. Moore.
And your job here at Henday, Mr. Moore?
President and General Manager.
Well, I certainly came to the right man for information. How long have you been building engines, Mr. Moore?
Just since we took over this plant and put it into operation on a production line basis a little over a year ago.
Well, that's a new way to build these monster engines, isn't it?
It had never been done before, but the demand for such a huge number of engines had never existed before either. We saw that enough engines were going to be turned out to power our shipping fleets. They would have to be built on a mass production methods basis instead of one by one, and that's what we're doing now.
Well, what's your secret of your success here at Henday in doing that job?
There's no secret to it. It's simply a matter of getting the men and the equipment to do the job, putting them into fast operation and making decisions quickly.
Well, you make it sound pretty simple, Mr. Moore. Is all your equipment new?
No, some of our equipment was worn out over 50 years ago, but these machines have been rebuilt and are giving a splendid account of themselves. We work on the principle that every machine and every man can do a job for victory. You can tell the world for us, Mr. Baldwin, that the Iron Men of Henday will turn out the engines to drive the ships to beat the Axis faster and faster until victory is ours.
And since this great new plant of yours is already turning out half the marine steam engines being built in the United States, we know that you and the Iron Men will do it, too, Mr. Moore. Thank you, and keep them coming off the assembly line. Ladies and gentlemen, this has been a brief story of American protection in this nation at war from the huge new plant of the Henday Iron Works near Sunnyvale, California, where modern mass production methods have revolutionized the building of the giant marine engines for our Liberty fleet. Bill Baldwin speaking. We return you now to New York.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is Fulton Lewis, Jr., speaking from the studios of radio station WOL in the nation's capital, Washington, D.C. Well, to begin with this evening, the President's War Labor Board handed down a very important decision today in connection with that seething question of stabilizing wages. And it happened to be the first incident in which the stabilizing part of the policy has come to light. Heretofore, they've stated the policy as a policy in the course of granting wage increases, first to the little steel industry, then to a large group of office and apartment house workers, service workers in New York City. The board explained on those two occasions that the reason they were granting the increases was that the workers in those cases had not received any increase in pay since before January 1st of last year, and the board felt they were entitled to an increase to make up for the 15% rise in the cost of living since that time. The implication of the policy was that the rulings was that if the workers had received enough of an increase to counteract that increase in the cost of living since January 1st, 1941, they were not entitled to anything more. But it was only an implication. That is, it was only an implication until this afternoon when the board ruled on a wage increase demand by some 2,750 workers of the General Cable Company at Bayonne and Perth Amboy, New Jersey. The finding was that those workers have received adequate pay increases during that period, and that therefore the workers are not entitled to anything more, which of course finishes the official establishment of this policy on the record by means of decisions. There was one vitally important and interesting sidelight of that decision, too. A sentence that was sort of tossed in, apparently by way of an answer to the argument of Mr. Leon Henderson, who, as you know, has been disapproving, frowning on any of these wage increases, regardless of whether the workers have or have not received a boost in pay in the last year and a half. I told you about that point of view by Mr. Henderson on Monday evening. This one little sentence that was tossed into the decision today said that the total cost of this policy of the board, if it is carried out for all workers of the nation alike, will be only 1 1/2% of the total payroll of the nation. The tacit suggestion being that that is not going to do much damage in the way of causing inflation. Mr. Henderson says, that any increase tends to cause an increase in the cost of living. The only two members of the War Labor Board who voted against this decision today were the CIO representatives, the CIO having been none too friendly to the whole policy from the beginning. The American Federation of Labor representative on the War Labor Board, who was present today, voted in favor of the ruling. About the synthetic rubber bill, which is on President Roosevelt's desk awaiting his veto, there are reports in very reliable sources tonight that what the president is planning to do is send the bill back to Congress with that veto, and to announce at the same time that he is having an exhaustive scientific investigation of the whole synthetic rubber mess made by some outstanding unbiased scientist, or perhaps by a small committee of outstanding unbiased scientists. My information is that the investigation is to be conducted just as quickly as possible, with a view to finding out whether any changes should be made in the rubber program as it's now set up in the interest of getting actual production of synthetic rubber more quickly. I don't know what better solution there is than that. The tragedy is that it wasn't done months ago when there was still time to get some real results. I don't know whether you realize it or not, but it's been almost 2 months now since you and I began going into this synthetic rubber picture. A sacrosanct, forbidden picture it was then. And if they had made the changes and gotten rid of the inertia and taken a little action then, we'd be far, far ahead now. As it is, all this time is lost because little men in big places couldn't bring themselves to admit that their past decisions were anything but 100% perfect. 2 months of rubber production in a race against the dwindling stockpile. It may be that the president will announce his veto and the appointment of this scientific research committee or individual by the end of this week. Now about Mr. Henry J. Kaiser and his program to use his shipbuilding facilities on the Pacific coast for the production of huge new cargo airplanes. A great deal has happened today. As I told you last week, there was a great deal of skepticism about that program when Mr. Kaiser came to Washington last Thursday. There were those, and many of them, who said that it would be impossible to get engines for the planes. It would be impossible to get aluminum or the necessary steel. There was definite sales resistance, if you will, in many, almost all quarters. Since that time, Mr. Kaiser has been taking those points in a calm, quiet way. He's a most mild-mannered individual for one who has done all that he has done. He answered them one at a time with facts and figures, quietly, And to those of us who've been watching the procedure, it's been almost fascinating to see the weakening of that sales resistance, first here, then in some other quarter. The War Production Board experts, the Navy Department experts, the Secretary of War Patterson, where they started with an antagonistic attitude. They melted a bit first, then they said they'd look into it. Now most of those attitudes are definitely on the favorable side, as you'll see by some very important and exclusive news, which I'll give you in just a moment. The fact is that Mr. Kaiser has deeply impressed Washington by the very simple medium of having all the answers to all the problems before he ever set foot here. You may have heard him last night on this program say that if we haven't enough steel, we'll make steel. If we haven't enough nickel or chrome, we'll get that somehow. The problems ought to be solved, and the side that does solve them is the side that wins the war. On the other hand, it certainly is to the undying credit of those Navy and Maritime Commission and Army and War Production Board officials who started in with their sales resistance that they did not allow stubborn, hidebound tradition to warp their judgment. It takes honest thinking, believe me, to toss overboard in 3 or 4 days the ingrained training and teaching and theories of old-line officers and old-line Navy training that has been ingrained for 30 years, and to accept just willy-nilly in 3 or 4 days a brand new, totally revolutionary idea. I think the reason for Mr. Kaiser's success here is that while he might be listed as all that claim about we would make steel if we didn't have it, we'd produce the nickel and chrome, that might be listed as mere empty talk from most people. But Mr. Kaiser has a record that proves that he has solved that sort of problem time and time again in the past. There's one incident I think you'd be interested in the construction of the huge Shasta Dam on the West Coast, when he had the problem of providing 10 million tons of sand and gravel for the concrete work on that dam, and the only available sand and gravel deposit for him with which he could do the job was a deposit 10 miles away from the dam site across a range of mountains. The railroad from the gravel pits went only as far as the town of Reading, which was still 1.5 miles from the dam site, and the railroad refused to build the additional 1.5 miles of track because they said that the river frequently went on a rampage and was likely to tear up the track as fast as they put it down. The way Mr. Kaiser solved that apparently insolvable problem was to build a conveyor belt. That is one of those endless rubber belts that carries material along on it from the gravel deposit over the mountains and direct to the dam site. He had it in operation in 60 days, and the cost of moving the gravel, including the total original cost of the conveyor belt itself, as well as the cost of operating it, amounted to about half what the transportation would have cost by rail. Now the news that I have for you on this question tonight is just this. There is one man in this government who really has the final supreme say-so as to whether this program of giant cargo ships by Mr. Kaiser is to go ahead or whether it's not. That man is none other than Mr. Donald Nelson, the head of the War Production Board. Mr. Kaiser talked to him today at considerable length. It was quite a long conference. They went over details and plans and every possible consideration. I talked to Mr. Nelson later this afternoon after that meeting with Mr. Kaiser was over, and Mr. Nelson told me that he is confident that he is going to be able to work out this program and let Mr. Kaiser go ahead with his giant cargo ship construction plan. He said that there are 3 problems. First of all, the question of whether these huge ships actually will fly and whether they'll carry the necessary payload to make them worthwhile. On that score, the aeronautic experts of the War Production Board insist that they will. Particularly Mr. Grover Loaning, who is one of the outstanding aircraft engineers of the nation and who's on the staff of the War Production Board, he guarantees it. Problem number 2, Mr. Nelson told me, is how and where to get the necessary critical materials such as aluminum and steel and other things. And problem number 3 is how to get the necessary equipment and machine tools to accomplish the actual production itself. Mr. Nelson told me that he believes that he has a solution for both of those problems. He may have to do some shifting here and there, and he may have to adopt some alternative ideas in one place or another. But the long and short of it is that Mr. Donald M. Nelson is determined to go ahead with his superplane production program as proposed by the amazing Mr. Henry J. Kaiser. Mr. Nelson told me that he's convinced that Mr. Kaiser can and will produce these planes. By way of corroboration, Mr. Nelson told regular news reporters later this afternoon that a special War Production Board committee, which he had named to investigate the cargo plane program, has recommended to him that the cargo plane program be at least doubled, and that he, Mr. Nelson, has placed responsibility for achieving that in the hands of the Army and the Navy. So we're on our way. Nazi submarines are helpless against flying freight cars 10,000 feet above them. The President kept his appointment pad almost blank today and spent most of his time reviewing the verdict of the military commission that tried the Nazi saboteurs, or to put it another way, deciding whether any or all of the 8 men must pay the death penalty. So it looks as though it won't be long now before we know the final outcome of that vitally interesting case. Incidentally, the case of the saboteurs has resulted in a mighty interesting little sequel. The United States Coast Guard is now in the market for horses as a result of their capture. Not seahorses, mind you, but the honest-to-goodness equine variety. The saboteurs, you remember, were landed on our beaches from German submarines. Now, the Coast Guard is going to mount a goodly number of its men on horses so that they can patrol all the beaches more effectively than they possibly could do on foot. Quite a number of expert horsemen have already been recruited to carry on the work, so let's hope that this latest development will turn out to be a horse on Hitler. And that's the top of the news as it looks from here, ladies and gentlemen. Until tomorrow evening, good night.
Again tomorrow evening at this same time from Washington, D.C. This is the Mutual Broadcasting System.
CBS World News brings you the early morning reports of its correspondents at home and abroad. Here are the highlights of the biggest news received up to 8 a.m. Eastern Wartime, Monday, August 10th. The Allied offensive in the Solomon Islands is believed entering the decisive stage. New rioting has broken out in India, and more persons have been killed. The Nazis have made new gains in the North Caucasus, and Allied bombers attacked the Axis Libyan base of Benghazi. And now, here is Harry Marble and the news.
Before calling in Australia, here are the latest details on the fighting in Russia. The latest Soviet communique acknowledges a new Red Army retreat in the Kropotkin sector of the Northern Caucasus. And special frontline dispatches say the Nazis are moving from this area southward toward Armavir and the Maikop oil fields. In 2 sectors of this front, 7,000 Axis troops were killed in the latest fighting. To the north, the Russians are said to have repulsed new German attacks northwest and southwest of Stalingrad, where the Nazis have pushed spearheads deep into Soviet lines. Still farther to the north, at the upper end of the southern front, the Russians have retaken more villages in the Voronezh sector. The communique says that an unusually fierce battle was fought at one point near Voronezh. Our first report from overseas comes this morning from the Southwest Pacific. After a brief pause, we take you to Australia.
CBS Australia, William J. Dunn reporting. While Australia anxiously awaits further news from the Solomon Islands of Estes, military and naval leaders in this area appear completely confident that the attack will succeed. A reliable informant told me today that the Allies had taken no chances in preparing for this drive. That the press had been deliberately held up until a force deemed more than sufficient for the assignment had been assembled. There can be no doubt that the attack is meeting with fierce resistance from land-based enemy planes, particularly when you note that the communique reports of attacks by our own fighters on vital enemy bases at Rabaul, Leh, Salamoa, and Gasmata in the past 2 days indicate no Allied losses. As a matter of fact, yesterday's raids on 3 of these 4 points resulted in enemy interception only at Rabaul, where 5 Zeros were shot down, but no mention was made of our own possible losses. This could be accepted as a pretty clear indication that the enemy is concentrating most of his available air arm at the point of contact with the Allied force, hoping to check our movement there before our own planes can do too much damage to his other bases. Actually, the continuous raids on Rabaul, Salamoa, and Leh are...
We've been getting a lot of letters from listeners who advise cooking with steamers and 2-tiered saucepans, if you have one. This is, of course, an excellent plan and saves a lot of fuel. A listener from Belvedere, Kent, used an old saucepan lid. Well, they usually last longer than saucepans, so you will probably have 1 or 2 to spare. Turned it upside down and knocked some holes in that from the inside. It balances marvelously on top of another saucepan, and you can put in your vegetables and cover it with the lid belonging to the saucepan underneath.
On August the 19th at 4:50 a.m., the South Saskatchewan Regiment landed on the beach at Pourville, 2 miles west of Dieppe. We were proud to be the first Canadian troops to step on German-held ground, and every man was raring to go. As our small boats crept into the shore, we could see light shining from some windows and smoke curling from a few chimneys. We thought how peaceful it was, and how soon we would disturb this quiet seaside town by rifle and gunfire. Except for the grim and determined look on these prairie lads' faces, one would think it was just another exercise. And a white-armed umpire was going to appear and tell us to make it look real. But this was a real thing, and we knew it. In a few seconds, we would be tearing into those juries with all the pent-up feelings we had saved in 2.5 years of hard training. With a sudden increase of speed, and then the scrape of gravel, the ramp of the craft fell down. Out we ran on the German soil. In no time, the skies were flashing with tracer bullets and flares. One chap was heard to remark, "Gee, this is better than the 1st of July." Over the seawall and into the town we went, each company going full out to their planned objective. It was soon apparent that the German posts were fully manned, and we were going to have a grand fight in our hands. All hell seemed to be letting loose. Not for a second did anyone hesitate. In they went, with yells and many a wisecrack. Like God, those Heiners are using live bullets. Hey, where's the umpire? I shot that guy and he won't let me bet. Go ahead. Nice place for a 48-hour leave, eh? A nice hidden 4-inch mortar and a light artillery gun were making the town echo with their continuous explosions. The road and bridge over the river was under constant machine gun fire, which threatened to hold up the show, and also cut some of the boys off across the river. The husky CO saw the situation. He took off his tin hat and, twirling it for all the world like a boy with his school book, sauntered across that bridge, calling back, "Come on, boys, they can't hit a thing. Come on, let's go and get them." And they did. And again later at another place, a pillbox was causing trouble. And the CO walked brazenly up to it and put it out of action with bombs. And again on the withdrawal, when 2 Cherry machine gun posts were hitting the boys on the beach, this one-man army of ours, accompanied by Major Orme of Weyburn and Private Kitchen of Regina, climbed the cliff and ended the war for those Nazis. All day long, this CO of ours was inspirational to the boys with his daring and leadership, and his name will always be honored in this regiment. On the other side of the bridge, Private Charlie Sodden of Consul, Saskatchewan, saw his section being in danger of complete extermination from a pillbox. He took his grenades and stood up in the road and walked right up to the strong point and tossed in his bombs. He killed 7 Heinies in that post. At another spot, a platoon of Germans with 4 machine guns and a mortar were holding a hill, which Private Berthelot, GB of Regina's platoon, were trying to take. Berthelot took the war into his own hands, and with a Bren gun firing from the hip, he advanced across the open ground, under covering fire from his platoon. He went up that hill and wiped out that post single-handed.
I'm broadcasting now about the Dieppe raid, at a time when details are just becoming available. I'd like to say this to you in Canada. We've suffered heavy losses, and I saw our men die, but never have I seen men die more bravely or fight with such great heart as our Canadian troops. The word Dieppe may rank with Vimy Ridge in our history, and our hats are off to the Royal Canadian Engineers and the Royal Canadian Army Medical Corps and the South Saskatchewan Regiment, and the Queen's Own Cameron Highlanders of Winnipeg, and the Royal Regiment from Toronto, and the Essex Scottish from Windsor, and the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry, and Les Fusiliers de Montreal. A lot of those men will never return to Canada. I believe a lot more will return after the war, if the German announcement of 1,500 prisoners is correct. And added to the above, the officers and men of the Calgary tanks, whose story is one of the greatest that can be told about our Canadian part in this action. This was a combined operation, and I've spoken about the Army. Playing an equal part with our troops were the Air Force, the Marines, Commandos, and the Navy. I'm trying to find out now what percentage of the Air Force was Canadian, because I feel sure it was a great percentage. At least 9 aircraft fell to Canadian guns, and many more were damaged. What a marvelous job they did in the face of intense fire from accurate and powerful German shore and ack-ack batteries. Our losses haven't been sustained without reason. We've learned a most valuable lesson which may enable us to free the continent of Europe and end the war. We know now how the German system of coastal defenses operates and how best to attack. We know the tremendous weight of artillery the enemy can bring to bear on the beach. That was the purpose of the raid, as set out officially and told before we set sail, to defenses and Germans and to obtain information. We did all those things, things which the Germans have never been able to do to us. We moved large forces across the channel unnoticed by the enemy. We landed men on all 6 beaches, and we landed tanks in our new tank-carrying vessels, and one of which I was a passenger. Costly as it has been to Canada, the raid was definitely a success. Without this experience, a second front would have been suicide. Now let me start from the beginning. The plan, of course, was a closely guarded secret, and the men weren't briefed until they were on board the ships. Although I didn't travel with the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry, I was present when their colonel, a fine figure of a man from London, Ontario, came on board and told them, "Men, we're going into action. We're going to do what we came over to do, get a crack at Jerry." And then he told them the nature of the operation and what was expected of each man. There were no heroics, no delighted yells of whoopee. The men were quiet and asked questions. It struck me that the questions were those that a general might ask when being told of an operation for the first time. What were the coast defenses likely to be? What aircraft protection would they get? I liked the spirit. We set sail in craft of all types under the cover of darkness. I was with the Calgary tanks in one of the new tank-carrying craft. It was a lovely night and reminded me of home. Hardly had we set sail, and our padre collected all the men together in the bow of the ship, standing in front of a new type of tank they were using, and he read from the 6th chapter of Ephesians with the aid of a flashlight. "Finally, my brethren, be strong in the Lord and in the power of his might. Put on the whole armor of God, that ye may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. Wherefore, take unto you the whole armor of God, that ye may be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done all, to stand. Stand therefore, having your loins girt about with truth, and having on the breastplate of righteousness." In a few words, he told us that in a few hours we would be striking our first blow to bring a sign of deliverance to the people of Europe, and the reason for this service was because we would need God's help. The men were quiet as we slid out into the darkness under the lovely stars. I could read my watch in the light of the half-moon, and soon we said goodbye to the dark shores of Britain. I had a chat with the officer commanding our particular troop of tanks, and he told me about the hard work they'd put in for weeks to get them ready for this action. He was confident in them and in his men, to whom he said all credit must go. And now I'm just going to quote from the notes I took as we went along, some written in the darkness and some written in heavy gunfire, so they are now smeared and dirty from the cordite. And all the time, I kept wishing I had a microphone in my hand. So taking notes in this way was my only substitute. On the way over, I went to sleep for a while, lying in my trench coat on a coil of rope on the deck. And then I went up on the open bridge with the young captain, a sub-lieutenant in the RNBR. And now for my notes, just as they were written. AA tracers, like red sparks, and there's a heavy red glow extending down the coast. Our bombers are at work. More heavy flash of coastal guns and bombs. Our aircraft are flying in close to the water and over us. And now dawn is breaking, also like a heavy barrage to the east. There are puffs of smoke in the sky, evidently from heavy German AK batteries, and the ships are weaving in. Our lads are calm, and the tank men, wearing black berets and sitting comfortably anywhere, are watching the action. The sky is becoming full of aircraft, and the bombardment is becoming intense. Heavy thuds are shaking us, even this far out to sea. The captain is calmly steering us along. Port tent, midships. One bright fire is burning on the port horizon. Our medical men have put on their steel helmets, and the guns are quieter. Perhaps the commandos have landed and are fixing them. The destroyers are holding their fire and sinking along beside us. The ships are spread out behind us in long lines with gun crews mounted, each flying a black flag and a white ensign. There are fighter patrols like flocks of geese high up, and the bombers are scurrying home in the low haze over the water. The fighters look like swallows, but in geese formation. It's now 5:50 in the morning. Fast troop-carrying ships are starting to pass us now. And there's a French chasseur carrying French commandos. The coast has suddenly loomed up in front of us with its white hills and its cliffs. And it looks like a race to see who'll get in first, get into action first. The sky is streaked with fighting fools, and so is the ocean. The destroyers are laying a smoke screen to windward, and now they're turning broadside and they're plastering the town with their guns. The smoke screen is lifting, and I can see ships everywhere. The small troop-carrying landing craft are moving in lines under the artillery barrage. A Spitfire has just crashed off our starboard bow and into the sea like a stone. We could see the pilot trying to get out, but he couldn't. The troops are heading for the beaches on either side of the town. The Royal Regiment to the left, and the South Saskatchewan and Queen's Own Camerons to the right. The Hamiltons and the Essex Scottish are going in the center, and we're following. 2 Messerschmitts have just tried to attack us, and the ship behind us has just shot one of them into the sea. Our tank troop captain has come up to the bridge to warn the captain that it's only a few minutes until our 0 time. He wants to get going. So we're hoisting our signal now, meaning we're shore bound. And in we go. It's now 6:45. Planes are everywhere overhead, but the shore guns are firing at us and at the small troop-carrying craft ahead of us. I can see casualties. Men are in the water. Our tanks are warming up, and they're starting to climb the ramp, which will be lowered like a drawbridge when we reach the beach. Machine gun bullets are whining around us, but our guns are cracking too at the aircraft over us. A tank landing craft is getting its tanks off behind the troops storming the beach, and heavy bombs have just dropped astern of us. It's a heavy Junkers, and she's trying to stagger into shore. She's full of lead from our guns. The tank landing craft ahead of us got its tanks ashore, but she's sinking now, trying to get out. And we're being stopped by orders from going in, and destroyers are laying a smoke screen around us. There's a heavy German gunfire from a tobacco factory. I can see it sweeping the beach. Another Messerschmitt is down. The AK fire is wonderful, and a heavy bomber has just been driven off. He was trying to sneak in on our right, but a destroyer's guns got that, Jerry. Our tank men are disappointed, but now comes an order to try to go in again, and they're delighted. The German shore batteries are still active. They're firing at us. 4 Focke-Wulf bombers have just dived on us, and 2 of them disappeared in flame. Our barrage is unbelievable, and I'm covered in black soot. Shells are falling on all sides of us. We can't get into the beach, and we're ordered again to retire. 3 pilots are coming down by parachute. Another tank landing craft has managed to get in, but has been hit. Some casualties have just been brought out to our ship, and the padre of the Fusiliers de Montreal told me about trying to get on shore. Men were killed all around him, and one lieutenant had a bullet in his arm while he was trying to push the padre down. It's now 9:25. The Germans on the cliffs are even throwing hand grenades on our ships below. 9 Heinkel bombers just passed overhead, and I saw their bombs leave the aircraft, but I was too interested to watch the gunfire than to care where the bombs landed. They were aimed at the destroyers ahead of us, but they missed them. We were heavily attacked again, and the convoy guns have just brought down 2 more Junkers. There's just a sort of flash of flame, and the bombers come down like leaves in the wind. And now dive bombers are attacking us. One of them has just been shot into the sea. Strong reinforcements of our fighters are arriving, and they're flying low around us to protect us from the dive bombers. We can't get into the beach. We've tried again, but bombs and gunfire are driving us out. I've just been knocked down by a heavy bomb. In fact, a stick of 4 bombs. I've very near missed to starboard. Some of our men are wounded. One of them is dead. Our fighters are wonderful, and they're fearless, and they're trying to protect our men on the beaches who are being re-embarked. Our aircraft are suffering heavily, and I've seen several come down in flames over Dieppe. The wounded are being brought off, but we hear that we have landed on every beach. Evidently, the engineers have suffered heavily, and were unable to blast away for the tanks for about an hour. The tanks formed a square on the beach, and they're protecting our men from being re-embarked. The colonel of our tanks has attacked a machine gun post on foot. The South Saskatchewans got in safely, but the Queen's Own Camerons following them have been hit by 6-inch howitzers, and there are casualties. I'm listening to our tank shortwave equipment, and I know they're fighting like fools on shore. I can hear one of our tank captains saying, "Come on over, boys, we're killing lots of Heinrichs." We're ordered to maneuver out of the harbor. It's afternoon now, but the destroyers are remaining behind just a few hundred yards off the shore, and they're sending in small boats to bring out our men who can get away. They're wonderful. We've been here 8 hours now, and small craft are streaming out under bombs and gunfire. Well, those are just quotations from my notes as I wrote them down. I wish I could continue, but my time's up. I wish I could tell you about the journey home and the hundreds of stories I know about personal acts of bravery. I wish I could tell you now how we feel as we wait for final news. But I'm going to be broadcasting again later tonight with several other war correspondents who'll be with me. And we may be able to give you the full picture then between us. It seems reasonably certain that our losses are as heavy as they were at Hong Kong. I hope you in Canada, despite those losses, will feel very proud that our men have been able to play, at last, the part they've wanted to play. I do know that they've fought well and that things which seem to have exceeded the limits of human courage and endurance, have been done to protect our troops during the fight and to get them off after it was over. Those of us who've managed to get back, even wounded, feel very lucky indeed. It's been a bitter, hard fight.
This is Rooney Peltier speaking to you from London. Tonight, I have 2 statements by leading Canadians on our participation in the Dieppe raid. Last night, you heard from General A.G.L. McNaughton, the commander of the Canadian Army overseas. Tonight's 2 statements, which you will be hearing for the first time, complete the picture. They mean that you in Canada will now have heard an expression of opinion on the Dieppe raid from the highest authority in 3 branches of Canadian life in Britain, the Army, the Air Force, and the civilians. First, we are to hear from the Air Force. This morning, at RCAF Overseas Headquarters, the Air Officer Commanding-in-Chief, Royal Canadian Air Force Overseas, Air Marshal Harold Edwards, paid tribute to those Canadians who flew the skies above Dieppe. Even as our Canadians were fighting on the ground,
so were the men from our dominion doing battle with the enemy in the sky over the channel and the continent. Here, then, is the statement issued from headquarters by Air Marshal Edwards, spoken for us by Flying Officer Jack Peach, Radio Officer, RCAF Overseas.
In the last few days of this week, the world has come to learn much of the gallant raid carried out by the Allied forces on the continental port of Dieppe. Canada has every right to be proud and humble. Proud because of the great deeds of her heroic sons. Humble in the face of the great sacrifice made by many of them. We of the Royal Canadian Air Force Overseas pay tribute to the officers and men of the Canadian Army Overseas, for they have proven themselves to be superb in the field. It was the privilege of our fighter squadrons and of our Army cooperation squadrons to take part in this great battle. It has been likened unto that other vast aerial combat, the Battle of Britain. Time and time again, pilots with their aircraft refueled and rearmed sped from their aerodromes back into the scene of the struggle. They flew high on the crest of excitement and fired with a determination to free the skies over Dieppe from the menace of the Hun. Knowing full well that down there below them, fellow Canadians, men from their own cities, villages, and farms were smashing their way into a German fortress, our Royal Canadian Air Force pilots struck at the enemy as never before. Now all the world knows what happened that day. The young pilots of Canada's Air Force proved themselves worthy of their predecessors who fought in the Battle of Britain. They too lacked one thing, mercy. They asked for none, they gave none, and their victory was a glorious one which we shall never forget. It was not only a day for the pilots. Again, as in times gone by, the ground crews worked like Trojans. They kept the aircraft flying. They cheered on their pilots, and they took no rest until the job was done. They deserve great credit. The vaunted Luftwaffe is licking deep-cut wounds, for we have shown what we can do and will do as the months go by. I extend to the ground and air personnel whose heroism over Dieppe is a lesson in courage and determination to us all, my heartfelt thanks and praise for what they did that day for the Allied cause.
Air Marshal Edwards' statement tonight, together with General McNaughton's message last night, completes the picture insofar as the leaders overseas of Canada's soldiers and airmen is concerned. And now, the Right Honorable Vincent Massey, who is seated beside me here in the studio, wishes to speak to you in Canada, not so much as Canada's representative in Britain, but rather as one Canadian abroad to all Canadians at home. Mr. Massey.
I spent Thursday afternoon in a great Canadian hospital in a southern county, where my wife and I had the opportunity of talking to about 200 Canadian soldiers who had been wounded at Dieppe. Some of them had just arrived. None of them had been there for more than a few hours. Some were gravely wounded, others less severely. They came from many parts of Canada. They were men from Montreal, some with French as their mother tongue, from Toronto, from Hamilton, from Windsor, Ontario, from Winnipeg, from Saskatchewan. A few of them had been born abroad, but they were all Canadians and proud to be Canadians, and they filled me with pride to be a fellow countryman. These men have written a new word on Canada's banner. Dieppe is now linked for all time with Ypres and Vimy and the Somme. We honor these soldiers who have given our national name new luster. Our hearts go out to those at home who are shadowed by anxiety, or whose path is darkened by sorrow. I shall never forget the impression that my visit to that hospital made upon my mind. In ordinary times, I've always found something a little forbidding about the machinery of a hospital, but this was different. Two things made it different. One was the quiet courage and the magnificent spirit of all those men who had just been admitted to its wards. They had all gone through the fire and had seen war in its naked fury in those few hours off the coast of France and on the beaches at Dieppe. Some of them were still patiently awaiting the operations necessary to give them relief. There were two things which they had in their minds. I heard them expressed time and again. One was, well, we gave them the works. The other, I want to get a crack at them again as soon as I can. You would have been deeply moved if you had heard them talk, and very, very proud. The other thing that makes this hospital something to remember is the spirit of its staff. For hours, cases had been coming from the coast. The operating rooms had been busy without a break since the first stretcher arrived. Emergency rooms had been prepared. An augmented team of surgeons and nurses had worked without rest since the beginning, and there was still much to do. The hospital gave a picture of superb teamwork, engaged in the relief of suffering and the saving of life. Every movement was marked by experience and skill. But these things by themselves tell only half the story. Healing is both a science and an art. And tenderness and humanity were there in full measure, as well as the efficiency that comes of long training. I can tell you that everything was being done for our men that human heart and human hand could do. No one who saw what I did could ask why Canada is famous for her doctors and her nurses. There was humor, too. A stretcher bearer had brought back from Dieppe as a proud trophy the paybook of a German army dentist. Another soldier had a souvenir in the shape of a waterlogged cap with a swastika at the front, and also a set of German playing cards, still wet with seawater. This boy had had 3 birthdays in the Canadian Army in England. He had only now celebrated his 20th. In the same ward was a grizzled sergeant on whose tunic under the bed I saw the ribbon of the DCM from the last war. Another thing we heard on all sides was an honest, moving tribute to the Royal Navy and the Air Force and the support which they had given. This had been a combined operation in very truth, and the 3 services had been integrated like clockwork. The Navy was grand, said one boy, and a naval seaman from that great service, a few beds away, grinned appreciatively. It was a humbling experience to visit that hospital, to see pain bravely borne, to see suffering relieved. There were some great human qualities one saw there in being: courage and constancy and kindliness. There was one supreme idea in the minds of all who lay on those beds and of those who tended them: to do their best. The men of Dieppe have stirred our hearts. They have set us an unforgettable example.
Thank you, Mr. Massey, for your moving tribute. For 2 nights now, the CBC microphone in Britain has brought you stories spoken by Canadians who went to Dieppe. Tonight's broadcast, the last of the series, will conclude with more of these stories obtained for you by 2 of the CBC's war correspondents in Britain, Bob Bowman and Jerry Wilmot. The first man to speak to you is Sergeant Arthur Souchard of St. Mary's, Ontario, who was with the headquarters of a brigade, the intelligence section to be exact, and who should know what went on. Sergeant Souchard.
We want to know what went on. Hello, dear. Don't worry. I've got a shattered elbow, but it will be all right eventually. And believe it or not, I've lost part of a big toe. But I'm really lucky to have got off even as easily as this, and I'm feeling fine.
And you look grand, Sergeant Souchard. It's a real tribute to you that you keep so cheerful with that nasty elbow. And I'm not forgetting about the big toe either. Well, now, will you tell us what you saw?
Well, I can add something to what Sapper Stratton has already told you, because I was on the same TLC. He was up near the bridge, but I was closer to the stern and got hurt by a shell which killed the helmsman. Another shell exploded in the engine room and killed the ship's engineers. The tanks were off then, and our job was to get out. But with nobody in the engine room, there seemed to be little chance. Captain Garno got busy then and found a Marine sergeant who knew something about engines, and he went down and got them going. Meanwhile, I stood near the door of the engine room and relayed messages to him from 2 Navy fellows who directed operations from the deck. They'd just call out right or left, and I'd pass that along. That's how we got out. because our steering equipment was broken. All this time, of course, we were under heavy artillery and machine gun fire, which was beyond imagination. It was so heavy.
I suppose calling out right and left, that meant you were steering with the engines, eh?
Steering with the engines, as far as I know.
And you were hurt at that time, but you were still standing there and yelling the stuff down, eh?
That's quite true.
Well, did you manage to see any of the action on shore?
Yes, I did see some action through glasses. I saw the Essex Scots advance against heavy enemy fire, and they showed no sign of panic, just kept moving forward. Because I was in the intelligence section, I also heard the RHLI capture their first objective, which was the casino, and they were still going strong. Then I saw the commanding officer of the cavalry tanks go ashore, and I know he later attacked the machine gun post on foot. Later again, he got into a motor launch, which was on fire, but I think he had a chance of getting away all right. In fact, there were many acts of heroism, more than I can tell you. Brigadier, for instance, he was badly wounded. He lay on a stretcher and directed operations from there. Then I told you about Captain Garner, who organized our getting away. Then there was the naval second lieutenant, who directed operations from the bridge when the captain was blown off. And he was marvelously cool.
That was Bob Bowman interviewing Sergeant Suchard of St. Mary's, Ontario. Now here is Sergeant Major Frank Mathers of Estevan, Saskatchewan, talking to Jerry Wilmot. The Sergeant Major is the first to speak.
One of our sections was advancing into machine gun fire. There were 2 light machine guns firing on them. Our boys were moving up on them, flanking them, and going to get them. When they saw that they were due to be captured or taken, 2 of them, beside the guns, got up and waved their handkerchiefs, white handkerchiefs, and our boys stood up to move in to take them prisoner. As soon as our boys stood up, there were other men at the guns. They opened fire on them. They knocked our boys down there. That's the way the Jerry fights.
Sergeant Major, I believe there was one of your lads in particular whose work you noticed over there that I would like to very much tell us about, if you will.
Yes, I'd like to tell you about Private Charlie Sodden of Maple Creek, Saskatchewan. His platoon was held up. They were in front of a pillbox with a mortar in it, firing 4-inch mortar. It's heavy stuff and it's dangerous, and it hits hard. The platoon couldn't go any further without them getting that out of the way. He handed his rifle to one of the other boys, took some 36 grenades, which are our Mills grenades, and walked up to it and threw them in. He took 5 Jerrys out of there. He got it, and he got back, and all he was worrying about while he was going up there was to call back to one of the other boys. When you come up, bring up my rifle.
It's good for him. And is he back okay?
He's back okay. He'll be with us. He's right on shape.
Well, there's nothing I can add to the stories of the men themselves and to the tributes paid to them by the highest Canadian authorities. The story of Dieppe has already been written for history in terms of endurance, blood, and heroism. As time passes, the story of Dieppe will be written in all Canadian hearts in the words of our own fighting men. And so you have been listening to the last of the series of special programs about the Dieppe raid, transmitted from Britain and prepared by the London office of the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. Good night, Canada.
Our secret weapon. Do you know we have one, you Americans? Do you know what it is? Well, it's simply the truth. The truth is a weapon that isn't secret in our country, but it's a big secret to the people who live in Germany, Japan, and Italy. Our enemies don't have this weapon. They don't dare let their people know the truth. Instead, they lie and keep on lying. So in this program every week, we're going to expose some of these Axis lies. Our lie detective is Rex Stout, the celebrated author and chairman of the Writers' War Board and a representative of Freedom House, an organization dedicated to the rights and freedom of all men. Here is Rex Stout.
It should be obvious that the United States...
Beat it, Tojo. I start this program, you don't. The purpose of this program is not to prove that Nazis and Japs are liars. Everybody knows that. But it is instructive and highly important to understand their technique. Recently, they seem to have got the idea that half a lie is better than none. Take, for example, these 2 consecutive sentences broadcast from Berlin on August 24th, beamed at Ireland.
The American operations on the Solomon Islands have come to a standstill. On the islands of Tulagi and Guadalcanal, bitter battles are still being fought.
No, I don't believe he thought he was putting over an Irish bull. No German would appreciate the debonair nonsense of an Irish bull. I've got a theory. He was absolutely determined to tell some kind of a lie about our operations in the Solomon Islands But on account of conflicting Japanese reports, he didn't know what the truth was. So he made those two contradictory statements, one right after the other, sure of one of them being a lie, so he would at least be batting 500. That may sound far-fetched, but if anyone has a better theory, send it along. I'm not being flippant. Whatever else we do or don't do about the Germans, we had darned well better understand them, what it is that makes them tick, or we'll make as big fools of ourselves as we did last time. Consider this. Here's the way the Germans handled the visit of Winston Churchill to Moscow. First, a broadcast of the official German news agency on August 2nd.
The meeting between Churchill and Stalin was very excited and hysterical. It assumed a dramatic climax when Stalin accused Churchill of betraying the Soviet Union.
And this went out from Berlin 2 days later on August 4th, beamed at the Middle East.
Churchill is in Moscow at this moment, where the establishment of a second front is being discussed.
And this on August 8th, beamed at England.
This morning, Churchill shook hands with Stalin at the Kremlin.
The Germans sure are great on detail. But those items were broadcast on August 2nd, 4th, and 8th. And as we now know, Churchill actually arrived in Moscow on August 12th. You can't beat that for a scoop. And they kept right on. This came from Berlin at 9 p.m. on August 16th, beamed at the United States.
The true reason for Churchill's trip to Moscow is now known. He wanted to see with his own eyes just how stable the Soviet regime is, and at the same time, to look around for other forces in Russia which would be willing to continue the war against Germany if the Stalin government should suddenly fall.
I like that one particularly. It is so vivid. I can just see Churchill sneaking up one street of Moscow and down another, his collar turned up and his hat pulled over his eyes, looking around for the next Russian government. And he had to get a move on because he had promised Stalin he would be back at the Kremlin in time for dinner. What a man. Well, that was August 16th. On the 18th, the British made the official announcement of Churchill's trip, and then Berlin really went to it. They sent dozens of different broadcasts in a dozen different languages in all directions, and no two of them agreed. Here's one beamed at Brazil at 9:15 p.m. on August 18th.
How deeply must England have fallen when her highest minister travels clear to Moscow to crawl before the Bolsheviks? England is now in such a bad spot, there's nothing left for her to do but to make a desperate appeal to the Russians, to plead with them to sacrifice themselves in order to save England.
Another on the same date at 5 p.m.
The Russian partner is seriously ill, if not already dead. That is why Churchill had to hurry to Moscow to shake hands with the man he hates most. The meeting, we are told, was dramatic. Strong words echoed in the Kremlin. Stalin refused to continue the fight. Churchill warned him that he must carry on.
And so it went. Churchill pleading, crawling, warning, threatening, Churchill whining, Churchill thundering demands, all broadcast from Berlin in English, French, Italian, Hungarian, Norwegian, Danish, Finnish, Bulgarian, Afrikaans, Arabic. But the funny thing is, not a single word about it in German. Not a word to the German people. Apparently, Churchill's visit to Moscow was not as tasty a bit of news for the German palate as Berlin tried to make it out. Finally, when the British had themselves broadcast it in German, directed where it would do the most good, casual and slighting references were made to it at the tail end of German broadcasts for home consumption.
It should be obvious that the United States...
Beat it, Tojo. I'm working on Germany. Or say we hear one from Italy for a change. It's all the same. This was broadcast from Rome at 5 p.m. on August 21st, beamed at England.
Mr. Roosevelt has got himself and his country into such a mess that he is now compelled to turn for help to the despised and ostracized Negro population. Mr. Roosevelt is encouraging the formation of a Negro regiments, and Mr. Knox is pushing Negroes into the Navy. Now they are putting Negro pilots on warplanes wherever there is any danger. The way Americans look at it, Negroes make excellent cannon fodder, and they should be proud to die in American uniforms, because that is all they are fit for.
That broadcast went on like that for 10 minutes or more, denouncing us for the way we mistreat the Negroes. Reading it, I was reminded of the time Mussolini's son came over here on a visit and told with glee what great sport it was to dive in his airplane at a crowd of Ethiopian villagers, men, women, and children, and let them have it with the machine guns. I was also reminded of a passage in Mein Kampf, the German's Holy Writ, writ by Adolf Hitler, in which Hitler said,
"As for the Negro, it does not dawn upon the depraved bourgeois world of America that it is a criminal absurdity to train a born half-ape until it is supposed a lawyer or doctor has been made of him. That it is a sin to let hundreds of thousands of talented men degenerate in the proletarian swamp while Hottentots and Zulus are trained for intellectual vocations."
And so on and so forth. According to Hitler, we are treating the Negro with a depraved tenderness and sentimentality. According to his Roman lickspittle, we are abusing him abominably and regarding him as fit only for cannon fodder. Both of them would wonder what on earth I was talking about if I told them that one of the things we are fighting this war to preserve is our Negro problem. We're quite aware of all its difficult and ugly aspects, but we also know that in this close association of the black and white races here on our own soil, we're carrying on one of the most interesting and valuable experiments in the development of human society. There are certainly extremists among us. At one end, those who regard Negroes as subhuman beings. And at the other end, those who demand that all of the Negroes' handicaps, social, political, and economic, must be abolished by tomorrow noon. But the great majority of us, both Negro and white, accept the problem for what it is. We face it realistically. And we're determined that whatever changes time and patience and intelligence will bring shall be for the common welfare, steps forward in our march toward a better and a happier world for everybody. That's what I mean when I say that one of the things we are fighting this war to preserve is our Negro problem. It's up to us to work it out, and we're going to do it, and the first step now is to wipe the Nazis and fascists off the face of the earth. Listen to this statement by Dr. Goebbels, broadcast on August 21st.
The division of the earth among people was not made by God, but depends on man alone and can be altered at any time. All political and economic questions are merely questions of power and not of morality.
You can imagine what would happen to our Negro problem if its solution were left to Dr. Goebbels. In fact, you don't have to imagine it. Read the testimony of any report recently smuggled out of Norway or Poland or Yugoslavia. For to Germans, everyone who is not German is subhuman. And they do not merely talk like that. They act like that.
It should be obvious that the United States...
Oh, beat it, Tojo. Tell it to the honorable Marines on the Solomon Islands. I have some more German gems here, if I can squeeze them in. Here's one beamed from Berlin at Ireland on August 14th.
The most significant of the recent developments in the United States is the re-election of the renowned member of the House of Representatives, Hamilton Fish, who received twice as many votes as all his opponents put together.
He's counting his chickens before they're hatched. Mr. Fish was renominated, not re-elected. In November, he may or may not cackle. Here's another gem. On August 19th, Berlin broadcast to England.
I recently came across a copy of the American Weekly Life, the front page of which proudly sported a photo of an American cavalryman standing by his horse in all the magnificence of his war kit.
Well, he went on for 15 minutes, sneering not only at the cavalrymen, but at the whole darned army and its equipment. It was a terrific indictment. Our soldiers, he said, are a bunch of softies. They wear doeskin gloves. They chew gum. They insist on eating 3 times a day. They manicure their nails. Their planes and tanks and guns are a joke. If they ever come face to face with a hard-bitten German soldier, they'll drop everything and run. Then he came to his climax.
But whatever sense of admiration could have been aroused in our envious breasts by the picture of the American cavalryman, it was unfortunately qualified by the fact that the hand held the reins of a bit, and one branch of the bit was noticeably bent. Now, wouldn't it have been better for the trooper to be gloveless, and that his lily-white hand should run all the risks of exposure, but that the bit should be of stronger quality?
No comments are needed, but I'll make 3. First, don't look at recent copies of Life magazine for it. It was back in April 1941. Second, not the branch of the bit, the shank. Third, the shank was not bent at all. It was merely made with the regulation curve of all cavalry bits. There, I nailed that dastardly lie. Here's another remark about our Army. More of it. Coming from Berlin on August 17th, beamed at us.
And now that it is becoming fashionable in America to disgrace the military uniform by recruiting soldiers from among the jailbirds, the logical step seems to be first to make Al Capone chief of the General Staff of the United States Army, and then to place him in command of all the armed forces of the United Nations.
Our soldiers seem to be a bunch of softies and a gang of jailbirds at the same time. Quite a trick. Still more about our Army, beamed at us the same day, August 17th, an hour earlier than the one you just heard.
The English people are relying on Americans to set up that second front in Europe. I can't see any purpose in American soldiers loafing about their camps and wanting to be entertained in English homes and dashing around chasing English girls. One has to think of the English fathers and mothers who are worried about their daughters' virtue.
So there emerges the authentic and fascinating picture of the typical American soldier. A jailbird panty waist with doe-skin gloves on his lily-white manicured hands, chewing an enormous wad of gum, pursuing English girls all over the countryside. When he catches one, I suppose he puts a bridle on her with a bent bit. Well, if that is what the German army has been led to expect, somebody is going to be surprised someday, and it won't be me.
It should be obvious that the United States...
All right, Kojo, spell it.
It should be obvious that the United States cannot win the war. It is time for thinking Americans to realize the real issues of this war. Japan is sitting on top of the world, controlling the seas from the Aleutians to the Indian Ocean. She controls half the natural wealth of the world, and it is being developed and utilized to strengthen Japan. She is prepared to carry on the war until her enemies are crushed.
That's a coincidence. So are we. Sorry, Tojo. Honorable time is up.
You have just heard Rex Stout, chairman of the Writers' War Board, bringing you another in a series of programs we call Our Secret Weapon, the Truth. It is armor for defense and bullets for attack. Each week at this same time, Mr. Stout will expose more of the lies put out by our enemies who hope to bewilder and confuse us as they have the people of little nations they think they've conquered. A copy of tonight's script plus supplementary material will be mailed to everyone who sends a self-addressed stamped envelope to Freedom House, New York, or to the station to which you are listening. And at this same time next week, Columbia brings you another in this new series of programs, Our Secret Weapon. This program was produced by Paul White and directed by John Dietz. This is the Columbia Broadcasting System.
Members of the radio staff at Radio House, University of Texas, are proud to have in their record library a copy of a broadcast on which Lieutenant Burford of New York State was interviewed. We are glad that we can make a copy of this record for the family of Lieutenant Burford. We would like to express to you the pleasure we knew in our short acquaintance with this fine young man. When our scriptwriter visited at navigation school to get material for the broadcast, Lieutenant Burford was assigned to work with the writer in getting the information together. Because he was alert and interesting and had a pleasant and cultivated voice, he was selected as one of the officers to be interviewed. When he flew down from navigation school to spend the day here at the university, several of us met him out at the airport and brought him here to Radio House. He relaxed from routine and had a big time with us that day. We know, and we feel sure that you know, too, that although Lieutenant Burford's span of life was relatively short, his excellent work as an instructor in navigation and the influence of his brilliant mind and charming personality will live on far beyond the duration of this war.
Watch your grip, keep your head up, it's your easy. We're the navigators of the Air Force. We'll win the war by charging through the course for the men of the sky, for bombers to fly. We'll beat down all our enemies and we fight on high. We're the navigators of the Air Force. Our heads are out, we're on a good course. For we fix our compasses, watch our grip. Over the top, we're on the wrist. Our LOB is the line of victory.
This is the time we've been saving to present a young man from the Army Air Force's Navigation School at Hondo. He's from New York State and was sent to Texas a week after joining the Army as a buck private about a year ago. And now here's Lieutenant William J. Burford, who made a special flight to Austin just to be on this broadcast. Lieutenant Burford is an element commander in the navigation school. He teaches dead reckoning and supervises the work of 10 other instructors. Now, don't let the word instructor mislead you. He's as young as many of the cadets he teaches. On the other hand, don't let the word young mislead you, because the things he knows about navigation...
Pardon me, but if you don't mind, let's get on with the show.
Oh, pardon me, Lieutenant Burford, but that's exactly what I'm doing. For a few minutes here, you are the show. But if you insist on being modest about your own accomplishments, we'll talk about navigators and about the things you teach navigators. Now, in the first place, I want you to tell us what it takes to make a good navigator. What kind of training and temperament is the best for those going into this vital phase of bomber warfare?
So you want to know what it takes to be a navigation officer on a bomber, do you? Well, in the first place, a navigator must be a man who can exercise good judgment at a moment's notice and under any circumstances, whether his plane unexpectedly runs into bad weather or a flock of zeros. And all his calculations must be accurate. There's no time out for mistakes, no matter what happens. The radio gives out, or the drift meter clouds up, or the wind shifts. Still, the navigator must figure out all the problems of time and distance and the course to be flown.
Well, I can understand about the radio or the wind shift problem, but what about this drift meter clouding up? What is a drift meter?
Drift meter is just what its name implies. We have to measure how much we're drifting off course and take it into account in our navigation. If it clouds up, we just don't know where we're drifting.
Then the navigator must be the type of fellow who can keep calm and cool and think clearly no matter how tight the spot.
That's exactly right. And his charts and instruments must be second nature to him. The navigator,
if you want to become navigators, have to have some college training to begin with.
Oh, you have the wrong idea there. No college training is required for cadets interested in navigation. After all, it doesn't take a college degree to keep a cool head and exercise good judgment. Of course, mathematics is required for the calculations that must be made. But if a fellow has a high school education and isn't afraid of the math he had to deal with in high school, there's no reason he should be afraid of the math required of him in the navigation school.
Well, Lieutenant Burford, there's another thing I'm curious about. In their spare time, what do the boys talk about most at navigation school?
Spare time, did you say? When a fellow's learning in 15 weeks, we'd ordinarily stretch over a year or two. Time must be rationed. And right now, the ration on spare time amounts to the same thing as none at all. Since talk takes time, conversation at the navigation school is more than 99% navigation talk.
You mean no idle chatter at any time?
No, not enough that you can hear it. Even in the barracks, it's shop talk about the training flights and the lectures they've heard that day and the weather.
The weather? Now, why wouldn't that come under the classification of idle chatter? I always thought the people who didn't have anything but the weather to talk about were pretty dumb at conversation.
Well, I used to think the same thing, but now I feel pretty different about it. Those of us in navigation realize how very important the weather is. The cadets in navigation school take a course in meteorology, so they'll be able to diagnose the weather, you might say. For on a bomber, the navigator is the weatherman. When a crew returns from a flight, it's the navigator who gives the weather report. His log shows what kind of weather has been encountered and what kind can be forecast.
Well, are the aerial navigator's forecasts as accurate as weather forecasts from ground report?
More so. After all, the navigator is up there where the weather really is. His forecasts include many more observations than are possible from ground reports.
I see. I suppose if it weren't for weather, the navigator wouldn't have much to do.
If it weren't for weather, the navigator wouldn't have anything to do. In fact, wind and weather is the reason for navigation. You could do your flying in a mass of stagnant air, that is, with no wind at all, there'd be no need for reckoning a course. You could just set your plane on a heading and leave it there. If it weren't for wind effects in the heading of a plane, I wouldn't have to be teaching anybody anything about dead reckoning.
Well, just what does the term dead reckoning mean, Lieutenant Burford?
Well, dead reckoning means determining the course of a ship without reference to visible landmarks below or the stars above. Although there may be a complete overcast above and only an occasional break in the clouds below, a navigator can determine the position of his aircraft at any instant by using the type of instrument navigation we call dead reckoning.
To me, that sounds like an accomplishment akin to magic.
If it's magic, it's just mathematical magic, because the navigator accomplishes it with his computer and his logbook and all his instruments, especially the drift meter.
I see. Well, in addition to being impressed with all the things you people accomplish in navigation school in such a short time, there's another thing that I can't forget about the men who teach and study there.
What's that?
Your complete absorption in all you do. You seem to have shut out everything in the world except navigation. And you're the most determined bunch I've run into lately. You act like the war is just over the hill or just around the corner.
That's exactly the way we feel. And we know how much depends on getting the bombers to their destination.
For it's the bombers that must spot the enemy and blast him off the earth. At navigation school, we've got to be serious. We have to act like it's final exams every day. We don't have time to slow up and take things easy, even for a few minutes. I haven't noticed the Japs or Germans taking any slower, have you?
No, I haven't.
Well, at navigation school, we may not be much closer to the war in actual distance than the rest of you people, but we're a lot closer in the work we do. We know the war is going on, not too many flight hours away, and there's no time to lose. The bombers must get to the right places, and the navigators must take them there. There's no time to lose.
You're right. There's no time to lose, and we know that you navigators will get the bombers to the right places on time. We salute you, Pathfinders of the sky, charting a course for bombers to fly.